and welcome to Elevating Voices in Memoir and Fiction, where we get to talk to authors and learn all about the amazing process of putting their books together. I'm your host, Joelle Tamraz, and my guest today is Mark Blackburn, who has just published his debut memoir, Final Approach, My Father and Other Turbulence. So here's his wonderful book. And let me start by telling you a little bit about Mark. Mark was a shoe seller in London and is now a writer in Somerset. He was the runner-up in last year's Ruth Rendell Short Story Prize, and his new book, which we've just seen, Final Approach, My Father and Other Turbulence, is published by Claret Press. Extracts have already been published in print and online and won him a prize trip to Sydney. You'll have to tell us about that, Mark. The book was also shortlisted for the 2022 TLC Pen Factor Pitch Prize. Mark has also had numerous short stories and other pieces published and shortlisted for prizes. He is also the creator of Brian the Barrington Bear. So multi-talented, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Tell our viewers about your book.
Well, my book has been described as part memoir, part travelogue. I started writing fiction, but I realized through telling people various incidents about my family life and stuff that had happened when I was younger, that perhaps one of the best stories I had was my own story. And I decided, I didn't want to write a straight memoir. I was born in, and then I did this, and then I did that. But it occurred to me that airports and aeroplanes had an undue influence and quite a relevance to some of the fairly extreme events that unfolded. And I decided that what I would do is I would write a chapter relating to each airport, and from that airport, if you like, spinning out into the story behind it and the connection with it. And that worked very well. It was a good way of working through the sort of crunch points and the things that I wanted to talk about in my life without it being too linear.
And that's one thing I wanted to ask you about the structure. It is a very creative structure, one that I'm pretty sure hasn't been used before. And how, I was going to ask you if it came from the writing or if you had that idea first of all and then wrote to the structure.
Well, if I'm being totally honest, I have to admit that a writer friend of mine was working on a memoir himself, and he had chosen to write about a golf course and the various holes on a golf course and the relevance that those holes had to him. And I realized that my childhood was spent in the flight path to Heathrow Airport. So some of the early chapters involved watching planes flying overhead, becoming a fairly obsessive plane spotter, and then going to airports like Heathrow and London Gatwick during the holidays to see what other planes we might be able to spot. And therefore, Heathrow became a fairly obvious starting point because that was when family adventures started, and it was when my obsession with aeroplanes started. And having not been abroad overseas at all until I was 12, as my very successful car dealer father became richer, the horizon started expanding. And then, I wasn't just watching planes, I was being on them and going to exciting places and starting to see the plus side of quite an extravagant lifestyle, but then starting to see the dark side of it as well, the underbelly of, yeah.
When did you start writing the memoir?
I probably started about 6 years ago, and yeah, I had been writing short stories and submitting them, and I wrote. I started working on a novel, and then the um, the obsession with the airports and writing Final Approach took over and replaced most of the other writing projects. And I, you mentioned about my prize trip to Sydney, which, and I'll tell you why later, I expect. But although I won a prize trip to Sydney for
You can
various
tell me.
reasons,
Yeah.
okay, well, I'll tell you. I mean,
Yeah.
another interest I had, and something else I was doing when I started writing, was I was very involved in politics and
Hmm.
actually stood for Parliament.
Okay.
Um, and I was a candidate in the 2017 general election,
Mm.
um, which Theresa May called at exactly the same point, the same day even, that I was supposed to be flying out to Sydney.
Oh,
So I had two of the biggest things in my life
that's
at
incredible.
the same, yeah. And I had to make a decision. Am I going to leave the political party in the lurch without a candidate,
Hmm.
or am I going to stand for Parliament and do my civic duty, as it were? And I decided that I wouldn't go to Sydney, and a friend of mine took my place, and I stood for Parliament. As you can tell, I didn't get elected, but because of winning that prize trip and having that sort of external recognition of I actually won it for a description of Heathrow Airport in the 1970s, and how in those free and easy days of the so-called golden age of aviation, it it wasn't such a anesthetic process. You could go to an airport and you could stand on top of the terminal building and you could wave to your family who were flying off wherever. And I likened the what was called the Queen's Building
Hmm.
on top of Terminal 2 at Heathrow. I likened it to a seaside pier, because it really was, in so many ways, it was like a seaside pier. It was, you'd go for a day out, you'd have candy floss, you'd maybe make one of those little vinyl records it sounded pretty awful, in one of those little booths. And obviously, that analogy um, won me that competition. And I thought, well, with this with this reinforcement, I'm going to write a whole book of this stuff. And yeah, and over the last few years, I've gradually got closer and closer to bringing it out as a book and finding a publisher. So yeah, and I've had a few extracts published along the way, and been shortlisted for a couple of prizes. A chapter was shortlisted for the Fish Publishing Short Memoir Prize, for example. So just gradually getting closer and closer. And then in the final stages of having found a publisher, kind of they helped me to hone it down.
Hmm.
Um, and I think I hadn't realized I was too close to the wood to see the trees, but I hadn't realized how much of the book was about my relationship with my fairly extreme father.
Hmm.
And my publisher kind of helped identify that. And I think through that, I built up some of those aspects, and some of the less important content maybe got reduced or lessened in emphasis. So, and the net result is a book that I'm very happy with. They're very happy with, and it's getting some very good reviews. So yeah,
Well,
so
that's excellent and well
uh,
deserved. I have read it, and I remember your, among others, that description of
thank you.
being of your plane spotting, and that won you
Yeah.
the prize. So that's interesting, because I was going to ask you about, your the role of your family in the memoir, and certainly at this point, in the finished product and with the subtitle, it's very clear. that there is this very important strand of the father-son relationship. So that wasn't as much present in the beginning, would you say?
I think it was always present, but I think I, as the writer, wasn't maybe as aware of it as a reader would have been. I mean, I think when you're writing, when it's your own creative output, sometimes it's very difficult to see that objectively. And I think there was a degree in which, or to which I felt that I was telling my story and about how I'd been a punk rocker and how I'd been a stand-up comic and how I'd worked in a bar in the south of France, and I think it became more evident to me that actually it wasn't just a kind of me and my life story. It was a more, dare I say, slightly more significant and a deeper look at actual interfamily relationships and the powerful dynamics and the effects that they can have on you and your development. And I certainly think that um, I had a wonderful childhood, and as I got older, the relationship, particularly with my father, got kind of more and more difficult, as you would find out if you were reading the book. But I didn't kind of appreciate, I don't think, to what extent that it's a fairly sort of classical story in a sense. And it did get to the point where we were, but it was extreme. I don't want to say everything that happened in the book, but it was kind of extremely fraught and something. I felt that there was a kind of lesson or an insight into some of the human condition and not just the father-son relationship, but family dynamics generally, and how you can sometimes subjugate your own will and your own initiative to wanting to prove something or to disprove something or to just try to make things right that probably never can be right. And I think by facing up to that and by writing about it and doing that felt like doing something about it and making me become active in the process rather than passive. And some of the early feedback I've had is that uh, far more people than I might have expected have identified with certain aspects of this. And it doesn't have to be, they don't have to be in exactly the same father son, or it could be a mother daughter, or any sort of family dynamic. I think if people have undergone those sorts of difficulties, there's things in the book that they can relate to, and I think that's, if they can relate to it and find something in it to reinforce their own position, then I think that's a very powerful thing, and it's something I'm very pleased to have been able to draw out.
Yes, no, absolutely. Those insights are there. And as I've told you, we're resonant. So
Thank you.
that.
Yeah,
Tell me a bit about, did your family read the memoir before it was published? And what happened there?
yeah, that's a really good question, and I, I'm probably horribly misquoting, but I think it might have been Colin Cruise O'Brien who talked about having, you need to have ice in your heart if you were a writer, and I certainly haven't. I'm quite a sensitive person, and I get quite upset if I think I've hurt someone. So it was a big deal, and I was concerned about it. But to a degree, I had to think, who do I, who do I mind? Whose opinion matters? Who do I not want to possibly hurt with this material? And I made every, I think you can't be complete. You can't totally spare everybody. If you're trying to tell your own truth, there will be repercussions, consequences. That's undeniable. But to answer your question, yeah, I got I did. My siblings were the ones who I cared most about because they've been through the most similar experience.
Mm,
Um, my father has now passed away, but to be honest, putting I was putting bits of it out there while he was still alive and they were being published, so that wouldn't have stopped me. But my siblings did read a pretty late draft, and I was quite surprised at their positive reaction to it. I thought that maybe it was me speaking from my own view from the mountaintop, they were actually very positive about it, and they continue to be very positive about it. And they my brothers have, especially my next brother Dan, were incredibly helpful with all the launch activity and sort of reenacting some of our childhood plane spotting adventures and going through that. So they've been very positive. To be frank, my mother hasn't read it, but not because I just think she doesn't want to go through that. She doesn't need to go through that experience. And for us, for the siblings, and me particularly, it might be quite a cathartic experience. It wouldn't necessarily be for her.
yeah,
But she hasn't um, been hurt or offended or minded at all about the fact that I have produced that book, and it hasn't affected our relationship in any way. I can't I can't guarantee that there aren't certain more distant relatives or people who were involved in the scenario who haven't um, maybe taken offence would be too strong, but whose feathers haven't been ruffled by it. But as far as I'm concerned, um, yeah, if you write personally and you're writing about other people, then there is a price you have to pay. Frankly, I think I've been lucky that the price I've had to pay isn't terribly high, and I feel that it's more important to have produced what I have. So, yeah, and
absolutely.
I would say, I suppose I'd say to anybody who was thinking about doing it is, well, who do you really care about, and yeah, if they understand you, they'll probably understand what you're writing, and it probably, I can't guarantee this, but it probably won't be as hard and as hurtful as you think it will be. But it's very early days, so I might I might live to regret saying that.
No, I think that's good advice. And you mentioned that your father was alive when you published some of the shorter pieces that
Yeah,
then made their way into the book. Did he read any of those shorter pieces?
I don't think so. I don't think. I mean, I think such was our relationship by that time, but I don't think he had a particular interest. But I may be wrong. He might have read them and just never said anything. He might have just kept his counsel. I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
And what was the hardest part of the writing process for this particular book?
Um, I think the hardest part was actually finding that balance between what can I put out there and what would I and what to. I mean, there were a couple of edits and some things were scaled back, and to be honest, there's one or two things that probably got missed during the process that if I could rewind the clock, just relatively small things, but maybe large things to those who, there's probably a couple of things that I might have changed. But I think that was the hardest part, you know, making sure that it was fair and responsible and not just a kind of splurge of, stream of consciousness and me shooting from the hip in a sort of irresponsible manner. So I think, yeah, finding the balance between what was hard enough and real enough to be interesting, but not without making it then too insipid. It obviously had to have enough blood and guts, if you like, there to make it interesting. But I didn't want to glamorize or glorify that, or unnecessarily go for the jugular.
At what point in the writing do you think you reached that balance where you felt like it was just right? Was it
Pretty
fairly
near the
late
end.
in the
Yeah,
end?
very late. Yeah, because I think it's important as well. I think when when I feel very strongly that your first drafts it should be, yeah, pretty raw and pretty much what comes out of you. And yeah, so I think it's fairly late in the process. Yeah. That I think another I think I mean I hope I've succeeded in this, and I think I have from feedback, is that I'm writing about aeroplanes and flying and aviation quite a lot, and that has to be interesting enough
Mhm.
that people don't switch off. They might be interested in the family psychodrama, but not interested in the the aileron level when you need to take off or whatever. So I think, again, hopefully I found the balance right. And some people have said, that they feel they know more about flying, and it's been a relatively painless and interesting insight into aviation, for a layperson. But I think, again, yeah, I think, and my publishers were helpful with this, because we did change the title, because there's obviously two very distinct main elements to the book. One is the sort of the planes and the aviation side, and the other is this family drama. And it's to synchronize and coordinate the two is quite a challenge. And
Yes.
yeah, the the title wasn't my working title. I'll be honest, was Final Approach: My Book of Airports,
Oh,
which which I admit it says plenty about the aviation side, but it doesn't really give you an inkling into the family side. So we did backwards and forwards, various titles, and always keeping with the Final Approach. And the end title was my work, to call it My Father and Other Turbulence. And I felt that the subtitle, if you want to call it that, with the word turbulence in, it kind of retains the element, the aviation element, but it introduced the family element as well. And so I think I'm pretty pleased with the way that I think the title reflects the integrity and the whole of the book.
absolutely. I think it's a perfect subtitle for your book.
Thank you.
Brings it together. How did the process of writing the book uh, change your view, if at all, on the events themselves?
Um, I think that feels more like a psychology question than a writing one. But no, I think, as I said, it was a fairly cathartic process to write about it, and I think um, that it helped me objectify them, and it helped me sort of remove the sense of my responsibility for events. I mean, one thing you often hear
Mm,
is that um, children, offspring who through no fault of their own, through a dysfunctional family or dysfunctional relationships, have suffered.
mhm,
Um, and I'm not saying I mean, I have suffered in some ways. Obviously, in other ways, I haven't. But people who have suffered, there is a tendency to feel guilt and to put the blame upon yourself. And I think that by writing everything down, you do come to a more um, objective view of the events and the facts and the behaviors that were illustrated. And I think that is a very helpful process to go through for your own psyche. And I also, I think in turn that that's one of the things I hope is useful about the book, because I think other people reading it would hopefully come to the same conclusions about the the trauma that they might have experienced in their own lives, or where you know it's not our fault, guys. These things were done to us, and we haven't used the word victims, and maybe that's a bit strong in my case, but we we were, if anything, we were more the victims than the proponents. And so, it's not our fault, it's not our guilt. We are not to blame. And yeah, we can be strong, and we can start to live a slightly less fettered life, I think, in that respect.
That's a wonderful insight, Mark, from writing your book and
Thank
for
you.
others, for sure. I mean, by
Thanks.
the end, without giving away anything, the end, there is a sense of peace and
Yeah.
also of time, because you do stay with the image of the planes and your varying and changed relationships with planes, as you say, from childhood, not having been on one, but already being very drawn to them, along with your brother, and then flying to all exotic destinations. And as your life took off, pun intended, and then as you say, that how you close the memoir, with the sense of peace. So it's that insight is embedded, but it's great to hear you talk about it more. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so did you want to add something? Or?
No, no, not really. No, no. I think that's how it feels. You come to the end, and you do find that, yeah, a certain peace, and there was yeah, that, and it's interesting the way that sort of synergy between my father's life ending and the book ending, and
Mm,
that is because I was writing it while he was still alive, and I literally got to the end as he was dying. So
mm,
that kind of makes it accidentally, I think, more powerful. But it wasn't a device that I used, or some sort of gimmick. That's really how it was. So I think you have this. Well, I had this sort of you know becalming at the end when yeah. Again, I don't want to say too much about, but there is this. Everything is over. Yeah, everything is, and there is this kind of void, which is quite gentle void, and in some ways it's quite empty, but in other ways it's quite positive, and it's just it's the place where everybody finds themselves in at some point, and it's the place where my book found itself at the same time.
yeah. Mm. So, what advice would you have for other writers who are embarking on a memoir project? It could be one learning or a word of advice, something you can share.
I think it's actually very difficult to get a memoir out there, and it's much more difficult than people might expect. And if you just go into your Waterstones to a degree, you'll immediately find out why. Because where's it going to be? I mean, you've got shelves and shelves of the latest fiction, A to Z, and then how do you actually categorize work like that? So and it's often said that unless you're famous, people will not want to publish your memoir. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't write it, but I think it's very important to find a device by which you tell your story. And I think the most successful, and my memoir's only just gone out there in its very early days, so I'm certainly not saying mine is successful, but I think it's successful in the fact that it's managed to get out there into the world. And I think you've got to find a story that connects with people beyond the story of your own life. And I've used the aeroplanes thing. That wasn't like a deliberate gimmick or trick, but I'm thinking about Lara Makin's mudlarking, for example. Ostensibly it's a book about mudlarking, but it's beyond that. It's a story about it is an autobiographical story, and to I think some of Jeff Dyer's work. I mean, Jeff Dyer's obviously got an enormous catchment already. But nonetheless, a lot of his work is about himself and his own life. But whether it's Roger Federer and tennis, or he'll find a way. He'll find a medium through which to deliver that. So my advice to anybody who's writing a memoir, who wants to get a worthwhile story out there, is to think about how you're going to deliver that in an interesting way that might appeal to people beyond the fact that it's just your story.
Yeah, that's good advice. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't talked about?
Well, I know you're talking to me about my book, but I've read yours as well, and I think to a degree, but to a large degree, you we there's a certain amount of common ground in some of our experiences, and I think your your tale is extremely strong, and you do what I've just been talking about. Really, I mean, the whole yoga trip is exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that kind of synergy between one's own life and and a lot of people would have had experiences. So of a similar nature. So I think it's lovely to talk to you about this and really talk about what's inside and behind the book. And I think I feel very strongly that there's a whole load of us out there who've got a strong story to tell, and I think it's lovely that we're doing it.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mark. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think putting your story out there in such an interesting and powerful way, just to show it again to our viewers. Final approach, my father and other turbulence. I can guarantee you have not read something like this. You will learn about planes, as Mark said earlier, in a gentle way, but also about more, very complex family dynamics and a very interesting tale. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So my book is available through all good bookshops and online outlets. You can also buy it from my publisher, Claret Press, or you can buy it from me. Yes, Google me, markblackburn.co.uk, and if you find me and you want to buy it, I'll sign and dedicate it for you, and I'll send you a little personalized vintage aeroplane postcard with it, so you get the whole final approach experience.
Oh, that's absolutely worth it. I'm sold, Mark. I'll need the experience.
Thank you,
Well, thank you
Joel.
so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and with
Well,
our viewers.
thank you for talking to me. I loved it. Thanks.